The origin of this integrated message system had to come from outside our time domain. Literally, we're in possession of a message system of extraterrestrial origin, and you can prove that, and we'll show you how. The real you is software, not hardware. The real you has no time dimension. The real you is eternal, whether you like it or not. Very few people really are familiar with the field of information sciences, which gives us, of course, communication and many other features in our culture. That happens to be my specialization. I thought it'd be interesting to really take a look at what this field of specialized study has to say about the Scripture. And the very idea that there are hidden messages in the Bible is a shock to many. Not just unbelievers, but many believers are offended or disturbed by that possibility. And yet we'll discover that it's actually quite scriptural and has some exciting benefits to all of us. These 66 books that we glibly call the Bible, even though they were penned by over 40 different guys over the better part of about 2,000 years, they're an integrated message. And I don't mean thematically, that there's a theme in the old fulfilled in the new. No, far more than that. That every detail, every number, every place name is there by deliberate design in the original. So that's the first thing, that we have an integrated message system in our laps. And once you discover its integration, you need to do that for yourself, and we'll show you some things. The second discovery emerges from that. And that is that the origin of this integrated message system had to come from outside our time domain. Literally, we're in possession of a message system of extraterrestrial origin, and you can prove that. And we'll show you how. Are there such things as hidden messages in the Bible? You know, the Bible says so. One example is Proverbs 25:2. It is the glory of God to conceal a thing, and the honor or duty of kings to search out a matter. I'd like to give you a little background in a technology that most of us probably have not had any serious exposure to. We're going to introduce you a little bit to secret writing, cryptography, and what that's all about. And we'll distinguish between codes and ciphers. Codes in the field refer to arbitrary designations, where you might have the number 347 mean a battleship, whatever. Arbitrary definitions. Without the code book, you're useless. In Paul Revere's Ride, the Old North Church, the lantern, one by land, two if by sea. If the British had had the most advanced Cray computers, they could not have broken that code, because there's no way to break it. It's a code. It's an arbitrary designation by arbitrary pre-agreement. That's what a code is. A cipher is what most of us think of, and there's two basic techniques in hiding a message with a cipher. One is by transposing the letters by some scheme, so the unintended cannot interpret it, and yet the intended can receive the message. Let's assume your plain text was Cinderella, be home before midnight, okay? First thing you'd do is put that in columns. Then you'd adopt a keyword, and you'd alphabetize the keyword, and that would give you the order. This is just one way, there are many ways to do this, but this would give you the order of the columns that you'd take. And so it would take column 2, then 1, then 4, then 5, then 3, then 6, with that keyword. But along came, as we move through history, the famous Cardano grill. The idea was that you would be in possession of a grill with some holes in it, or you'd have the formula by which to cut a grill with those holes, either way. And if you took a message, and this is obviously a very crude message to give you an idea, for leverage, try only cereals listed in Social Lovers editions. It deliberately is meaningless. But if you take the Cardano grill, if it's the right one, and you put that over the message, and take the letters that are exposed, it says, flee at once, all is discovered, okay? By simply selecting from the message certain letters. This is the kind of code you find in the Bible. One of the simplest forms of this is simply to take every nth letter, every third letter, or every fourth letter, or every fifth, whatever. And with a computer, of course, you can try all of them and discover all kinds of hidden messages. What are their significance? We'll get to that. So this is the Cardano grill. But the method that derives from all of these that we encounter, and there's been a lot published by, is what's called the equidistant letter sequences, which is really just a variation of the Cardano grill with the simplest possible formula. A fixed linear sequence of skipped letters. And what's interesting, very few people today are aware that taking this to the next level, a nonlinear sequence of more complicated things. The equidistant letter sequences are actually not very useful for secrecy. They're easy to find. But they can be used to authenticate a message because they're very, very hard to simulate. And interestingly enough, that's exactly what God has done with His Word. Since God has the technology to create us in the first place, does He have the technology to get a message to us? Of course He does. The trick is, how does He authenticate His message? How does He let us know that it's really from Him and not some kind of contrivance or a fraud? That's called authentication. And we'll talk about some surprising ways God has done that within your text. Well, we've talked about transposition ciphers, but by far the more important category of ciphers are substitution ciphers in several categories: monoalphabets, polyalphabetic, polygraphic, and some more advanced forms. The Caesar cipher is perhaps the simplest, used literally in those days. The idea is very simple. If you take a sentence, you would take not those letters, but some formula of letters. Say, for an example, each letter would be substituted for the letter that was the third after it in the alphabet. So if that's the case, this is a fascinating session. It would translate into a series of letters that would be absolutely meaningless unless you realize that each letter really is alluding to a letter 3 steps before it in the alphabet. Do you follow me? Very simple, and yet unless you know that, it's pretty tricky. But all of these, in effect, are one-on-one mapping, where you take some alphabet and you simply one-on-one map it. In this particular example on the screen, the word enemy becomes SWSHP. And because for the E, you substitute the S, and for the N, you substitute the W, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things you'll discover, by the way, and I anticipate a little bit of the talk here, as history goes on, most of the kings in Europe had on their staff former Jewish rabbis. And many of the rabbis drew upon traditions that go way back among the scribes. And one of the things that's going on today is the rediscovery of some of the techniques that were prevalent back then. But, well, of course, out of these techniques came devices. Alberti's cipher disk being an example of that. The Wheatstone disk that followed. Thomas Jefferson had his wheels, and Babbage had his difference engine, which led to the computer industry. The Enigma machines in World War II were a major factor in what was going on. Turing and von Neumann machines were invented to do that, and out of that, of course, came what we think of as the modern computer. And, of course, modern computers are a whole different ball game. You know, the technology in computers doubles about every 18 months, has for years. If you have a laptop with a Pentium 3 in it, and if you had had that in 1995, it would have been classified as one of the 500 fastest computers in the world. We laugh at that now. Let's get at it now with this little quick survey. What about the Bible codes? We hear so much about that. And when they say Bible codes, what they mean, whether they know it or not, is a specific code called the equidistant letter sequence, or ELSs. There's a lot of fanciful stuff, a lot of stuff contrived that's been popularized in recent books that's too bizarre to be accepted, yet some of it is too impressive to be ignored. So let's steer a path through this. And I'm going to suggest to you some professional competence in cryptology is essential to adequately evaluate what we're getting into here. As early as the 16th century, Rabbi Cordovaro said, the secrets of the Torah are revealed in the skipping of letters. And around that profound insight, a rabbi by the name of Weissmandel, after World War I, started to check in. Now, what do we mean by equidistant letter sequence? Well, here's just a contrived sentence to give you an idea. Rips explained that each code is a case of adding every 4th letter to form a word. In other words, if you take every 4th letter in the thing that's on the screen, it spells out another message, which in this case simply says, read the code. The point is, you can embed in a rational message another message of a totally different kind. The message might be reinforcing, which could be used for authentication, or it could be new information altogether. Well, having said all that, let's take a look at the book of Genesis in Hebrew. Relax, we don't have to get into the Hebrew here, but if you go to the first how, and then you count 49 letters, you come to a vav, and you count 49 letters, you come to a resh, and you count another 49 letters, and you come to a hey. Now that happens to spell Torah. You say, well, that's kind of curious, but just a statistical, accent perhaps. With switching theory, you could probably calculate the odds. It's very, very rare, as you can imagine. But you're puzzled by this, so you go to Leviticus, nothing happens. But you get to Numbers, something even weirder happens. The same thing happens if you spell it backwards. And when you go to Deuteronomy, you have the same equivalent type of thing, say. You got Torah spelled backwards in 49-letter intervals. You say, what on earth is this? Is too designed to be accidental. And what's the point? Well, you go to the middle book in the 5, it's Leviticus, and now we're not talking 49 letters, we take the square root of that, 7, and we discover that in intervals of 7, you have the name of God. So we have Genesis and Exodus, it goes in the proper direction. Numbers and Deuteronomy, it goes backwards, and in the middle you have Jehovah. In other words, the Torah always points to Jehovah. This is a design in the text. And yet the text is not contrived. It carries the most important narratives in the Bible. And so we look at this, and what do you make of this? I'm not sure. If that was all there's to it, it's just a curiosity, there's more. Why 49, by the way? That's a strange thing. It's the square of 7, of course. Well, in Leviticus 23:17, we know that 7 sevens are significant in the Scripture in several ways. One of the ways is at the Feast of First Fruits, they count 49 days, and the next one is the Feast of Weeks, the Hak Shavuot, which is the prophetic day of the church being born, and there's a lot more to it. I'll leave that for now. In the book of Ruth, which is one of the most interesting books of prophecy, a little 4-chapter book that unless you understand the book of Ruth, you will not understand the book of Revelation. But in Genesis 38, Judah and Tamar, remember, gave birth to Perez and Zerach. Boaz descended from Perez, okay? Boaz, in book of Ruth, marries Ruth. They had a son named Obed, who had a son named Jesse, who was the father of David. You with me so far? Well, in Genesis 38, these names are encrypted at 49-letter intervals in chronological order. The probability of just having the names there is in the neighborhood of, I think, 1 in 10,000, but the probability of having them in chronological order turns out to be 1 chance in over 800,000. So is this accidental? Is this just a coincidence of statistics? There's a big debate on those things. Well, the ellipse closes. See, the Kabbalists, these mystical rabbis, had traditions as how you handle the text. And in the Renaissance period, as these techniques became very important to the courts of Europe, the staff of most of these kings were some rabbinical expertise that translated this into the field we call cryptology. And as that matures, we start having mechanical aids that ultimately leads to the Enigma machines in Germany, the wartime computer development, and the rediscovery of the codes themselves. The loop is closed. See, in other words, it was that technology that created the codes that gets reflected ultimately in machinery, which now allows us to rediscover things that the ancient rabbis knew. If you look at Genesis 2, the end of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2, you have a section of text. It starts in Genesis 1:29. God says, "Behold, I've given you every herb-bearing seed," and so forth. And that whole passage ends with verse 9 of chapter 2. "And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for the food, and the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge, good and evil." Those of you familiar with Genesis, that all sounds familiar. What you may not realize is that in the Hebrew text, you have encrypted in that passage the name of every tree that occurs in the Bible. And there's like 25 of them. And they're all in there fairly tightly encrypted in that passage. Now, what's the chance of that happening by accident? I promise you, though, that we would focus on the ultimate code. In a coding sense, it's the ultimate code. And the ultimate code, of course, is guess who? You. What library, the books in this library are read more often than any other library in the world? The answer is your DNA. You have a master record, and it is unraveled, copied, and rolled up in ways that defy one's imagination. Remember Paul Revere's ride, one if by land, two if by sea. It also has a syntax. The lantern had to be in a particular place. In this case, in the famous poem, it had to be in the Old North Church. See, the most advanced computers could not have broken Paul Revere's code. Why? Because it was a code, not a cipher. It was just arbitrary, but still it had semantics. There are very simplex alphabets. We've talked about those. But it may surprise you to discover there are codes that are error detecting. When you send a byte in a computer, you have an extra bit or so that's called a parity bit, which is always either odd or even, so they can tell if you've dropped a bit in transmission. It's a way of catching mistakes. If you want to add not 1 bit, but 3 bits to that byte, you can make it error correcting. You can make the 3 bits determine the position of the error, and if it's binary, you can obviously reverse it. So there are codes that are error detecting and they're error correcting. So there are also codes that will modify themselves. They're adaptive coding. They'll adapt to the syntax and so forth. Why am I getting... I'm not here to explore those codes except to point out one of the most advanced codes known to man is in our DNA. What people overlook about your DNA is a 3 out of 4 error-correcting self-replicating code. And there's probably not one engineer in 1,000 that would know how to even go about designing one of those. And yet, of course, we're taught that it all happened by chance. You and I are just random results of randomness. You know, it's amazing. We found the most insulting God to invent. You know, the ancient pagans worshipped, they attributed their creation to gods of stone or iron or wood, whatever. We've found a more insulting God of all. We attribute it all to randomness. God wasn't even necessary. God is offended by not being worshipped or putting our worship to these false gods. But what's even more insulting is to deny that one is even necessary. But anyway, your simplest cell is more complex than the River Rouge plant. It involves, the simplest cell is an entire city with garbage disposal facilities, manufacturing plants, input-output controls, gates, gatemen. It's astonishing, the complexity of the simple cell. But anyway, the DNA code consists of unique assemblies. They selected from over 200 proteins, each involving over 3,000 atoms in three-dimensional configurations. And it's all defined from an initial alphabet of 20 amino acids. And those 20 amino acids are defined by, in effect, 4 codes. The genetic code, where it's so much in the news, I'm just going to highlight a few aspects of this that you may not be sensitive to from a coding point of view. In your cell, there is your DNA. That is your master record, your master blueprint. To conduct all the things that are going on, they don't endanger that. They make a copy of it for the workers. There's a transcription that makes the RNA, which you can look at like a photocopy of the master blueprint. And then that RNA is translated to create the proteins, which are in effect functional machines. And the Crick dogma, of course, was that you go from the DNA through the RNA, you go downhill. The shocking discovery is that there are retroviruses that will actually not only create disease, it'll go back and alter your master record. And that's a whole other thing. But I wanted to mention something about the DNA being transcribed. The DNA, before it's made in the RNA, something interesting happens. That there are sections of it that are selected out. You realize these are equidistant letter sequences. This is a form of encryption that we find in the Bible and you find in your DNA. These have intrinsic chemical affinity towards one another, so where you have one, you have its mate. And this kind of coding scheme allows you to split it, and it will find its mates. It's an intrinsically self-replicating code. It'll copy itself without error. And that itself is an interesting design feature. It's intrinsically self-replicating. These 3 out of 4 codes will specify any of the 20 amino acids you're going to need for the proteins, plus leave some over for punctuation. You have start controls, stop controls, that kind of thing. So you have an alphabet designed here that is operative. And your messenger RNA, of course, needs to be translated into proteins. So there are machines that emerge out of all of this that will transfer the RNA, and what it does, it will read that code and decode it. And as it moves along, it knows from the coding what protein it's talking about, and it strings those along to create a protein chain. And that protein chain has characteristics that will cause it to form a three-dimensional machine. We're going to talk about a hemoglobin molecule. That has 574 elements selected from an alphabet of 20. And here's the composite of them. There's elements of all these different amino acids in a specific sequence, and if you don't have that sequence, you have hemoglobinopathy. It's fatal. The formula for the linear arrangements is a factorial thing. Anyway, it's 10 to the 600 with 650 zeros. Just one of them is hemoglobin. The others are hemoglobinopathy. So did this happen by chance? Hardly. Let's take the bacteria with a flagellum. You've probably seen them under microscopes in school. Flagellum has a little tail that propels it through the fluid. If you examine that, there's a place where that little tail, the flagellum, enters the bacteria. And we're going to look at just the place where it enters, and we discover something very interesting. There is what's the equivalent of an electric motor with slip rings, all kinds of over 40 parts, any one of which is missing, it doesn't work. And so this is not something that could have happened. It's something that was very skillfully designed. Anybody that's ever been on a design team knows that designs don't happen. They have to be crafted. See, the real question, the reason the evolutionists can't explain life, they can't explain which came first, the DNA or the proteins. You can't have proteins without the DNA, you can't have the DNA without proteins. It's even deeper than the chicken and egg classic one. It takes protein to construct the DNA, it takes DNA to make the protein. See, they both had to be created at the same time in a consistent system architecture. Which came first, the DVD or the DVD players? They have to come together to create a function that's useful. Same sort of concept. Every engineer would know that the whole concept of evolution is absurd. But the real you, I can see the real you is software, not hardware. Call it soul, spirit, give it what vocabulary you like. The real you is software, not hardware. The real you has no time dimension. The real you is eternal, whether you like it or not. The dilemma is, where are you going to spend it? Are you going to spend it in the presence of God? Are you qualified to be perfect, to be in His presence? Or will you be denied His presence? You see, you're in this little parenthesis that some people call a boot camp for eternity.